Yep, got him right here. Prospect Emerson. Hey, show me your hand! Get your hands out of your pocket! Get your fucking hands out of your pocket! Shots fired! Shots fired! Suspect down! Police action! Fucking hand! Oh, wait! Show your fucking hand! Hands out! Hands out! Hands out! Hands out! Hands out!
I'm beside you.
Hands out!
I'm with you.
Okay.
Moving. Hands. I got hands. Go.
I got lethal.
The phone lay half hidden in the grass of Bear Creek Park, its cracked screen glowing faintly in the morning light. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a lost item, but as the man who found it leaned closer, he froze. The glass was smeared with thick, dark streaks, blood. Too much blood for anyone to walk away from. Investigators arrived within minutes, and what they uncovered was far more chilling than a misplaced device. This phone belonged to 4-year-old Felicia Johnson, a young woman from California who had come to Houston chasing a dream. Within hours of stepping into a stranger's car for what she thought was a harmless meeting, she had vanished without a trace. Now, her blood-stained phone was the only witness. Behind this simple, everyday object was a story of hope, deception, and premeditated cruelty. And the man who had promised her $500 for one night, the man she believed could buy her time to keep chasing her future, was about to be unmasked as something far darker than she could have imagined. Felicia Johnson's story begins with a dream, the kind of dream so many young people carry with them when they leave the comfort of home and strike out into the wider world. Born and raised in San Diego, California, she was known to her family and friends as someone with a radiant energy, a young woman who embraced life with both confidence and vulnerability. Her father, Kevin Johnson, often described her as a fighter, someone who had endured hardship, but who always pushed forward with her chin held high. Felicia's life had not always been easy, yet she was determined to make something of herself. In April of 2022, Felicia made a decision that would forever change her path. She left San Diego and boarded a plane to Houston, Texas. To those who knew her, the move was both exciting and nerve-wracking. She had mentioned opportunities she wanted to pursue, chances that could lead to stability and growth. Like many her age, she was searching for independence, a way to provide for herself, while also chasing something more meaningful. Houston, with its vibrant nightlife and bustling energy, seemed like a city where she might find it. But beneath the promise of opportunity, Houston also carried shadows. It was a place where predators waited for the vulnerable, watching for those who arrived alone, who carried dreams too big for their wallets, who were willing to take chances they might not otherwise take. Felicia stepped into this environment unknowingly, her optimism blinding her to the dangers lurking just out of sight. On the night of the 15th of April 2022, Felicia found herself outside a nightclub on the city's west side. The plan had been simple. She would celebrate her birthday, maybe meet new friends, enjoy the music and atmosphere. But as the evening unfolded, that plan collapsed. She was denied entry to the club, and for a young woman alone in a new city, the rejection was more than just disappointing, it was destabilizing. She found herself stranded, vulnerable, and unsure of what to do next. It was in that vulnerable moment that a stranger reached out to her. His name was Chuck Wubuka Nwabodo, though she would not have known it then. To Felicia, he was simply someone offering help, someone who seemed kind enough, trustworthy enough, to give her a way out of a difficult night. The offer he extended came through Snapchat. $500 in exchange for her company. It was pitched casually, almost harmlessly, as though it were just a quick arrangement between two adults. For Felicia, who was already frustrated and stranded, the money must have seemed like a lifeline, a chance to reset, to regroup, to turn a disappointing night into something useful. She accepted. What she could not have known was that this agreement had nothing to do with generosity or companionship. It was a trap, carefully baited and waiting for her to step inside. Behind the mask of friendliness was a man with a violent history, a man who had scouted for victims before, who had searched online for how to dispose of bodies, how to cover up evidence, how to end a life without leaving a trail. Felicia was not the first woman he had approached, but tragically, she would become the one who did not escape. That night, she climbed into his car. Witnesses later reported seeing her leave the area with a man, though at the time no one realized the danger. She likely told herself it was only for a short while, that she would be safe, that $500 would be hers, and tomorrow she could start again. As the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the Houston night, Felicia Johnson unknowingly left behind the last safe place she would ever stand. Hours later, Felicia's phone would be discovered in Bear Creek Park, its screen cracked, smeared with blood. For investigators, the sight was devastating. Phones are lifelines. They carry calls, messages, and digital footprints that can tell a story. But in this case, the phone's silence was more chilling than anything it could reveal. Felicia was gone, and all that remained was the undeniable evidence of violence. The amount of blood on the device told investigators what no one wanted to believe. She had been gravely injured, perhaps fatally so. And somewhere out there, her body was hidden. The discovery sparked a desperate search. Kevin Johnson, Felicia's father, flew to Houston as soon as he received the call. He joined police, volunteers, and community members as they combed through fields, woods, and neighborhoods, holding on to hope that his daughter might still be alive. For days, he retraced her last steps, visiting the nightclub, speaking to witnesses, and pleading publicly for information. Each day that passed without answers deepened his dread. Detectives began piecing together the fragments of Felicia's last hours. Through digital records, they traced her Snapchat messages to the man she had agreed to meet. They identified him as 8-year-old Chuck Wubuka Nwabodo, a man with a disturbing history of online searches related to murder and dismemberment. Inside his apartment, investigators would later find traces of blood, DNA evidence that linked directly to Felicia. But in those early hours, all they knew was that she was missing, and the clock was ticking. The case was already beginning to take on the shape of something far darker than a simple disappearance. It was not the story of a young woman who had gone out and failed to come home. It was the story of a predator, a carefully laid trap, and a victim who had been pulled into it without ever realizing the danger she faced. For Kevin Johnson, it was the start of a nightmare that no parent should ever endure. The slow, dawning realization that his daughter might never come home, that she might already be gone, and that the man responsible was still walking free. The hours after Felicia Johnson disappeared became a blur of confusion, dread, and unanswered questions. For Kevin Johnson, the father who had always prided himself on protecting his daughter, every minute felt like an eternity. He had raised Felicia to be strong and independent, but now that strength seemed to have placed her in the path of danger. When the call came that her blood-stained phone had been found abandoned in Bear Creek Park, it shattered whatever fragile hope he had been clinging to. Kevin boarded a flight to Houston immediately, determined not to waste a second. Upon landing, Kevin didn't hide behind closed doors or wait for updates from afar. He put himself in the center of the search. Photographs of Felicia were printed and circulated through the city. Flyers appeared in store windows, taped to streetlights, and shared endlessly online. Community members, many of whom had never met Felicia, joined in the search efforts. For them, her disappearance was not just a personal tragedy, but a collective wound. They could not understand how a young woman could vanish so suddenly, leaving behind only a phone and a trail of blood. Detectives from the Houston Police Department were equally unsettled. The details emerging from Felicia's last known moments painted a disturbing picture. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and digital forensics all pointed toward the same conclusion. She had willingly entered a vehicle with a man she believed she could trust, and then she had vanished. The man behind that trust, investigators discovered, was not a stranger to violence, at least not in thought. His name surfaced quickly in their inquiries. Chuck Wubuka Nwabodo. Nwabodo was a 28-year-old man with no prior convictions, at least not ones that raised immediate red flags. But as detectives dug deeper into his background, what they uncovered was chilling. Search histories on his devices revealed inquiries about how to dismember a body, how to dispose of human remains, and how to cover up evidence of murder. These were not casual or idle searches. They were methodical, detailed, and repeated over time, suggesting someone who had thought long and hard about committing such acts. To investigators, this wasn't just a man who had acted impulsively. This was someone who had been preparing, waiting for the right opportunity. When they connected his digital footprint to the Snapchat messages exchanged with Felicia, the trap became clear. He had targeted her precisely when she was vulnerable, stranded outside a nightclub, far from home, and eager for a way to salvage her night. To him, she was not a person, she was prey. As detectives pieced this together, Kevin Johnson walked the city streets searching for his daughter. He retraced her steps outside the nightclub where she had last been seen, asking strangers if they had noticed anything unusual. At night, he prayed for a miracle, refusing to believe she could be gone. But deep down, the discovery of her blood-stained phone gnawed at him. It was evidence too grim to ignore. The search for Felicia soon expanded to include wooded areas, creeks, and abandoned lots. Volunteers carried flashlights and combed through the underbrush, hoping for even the smallest clue. Each time the search parties returned empty-handed, the weight on Kevin's shoulders grew heavier. He spoke to the media often, his voice trembling but firm, demanding answers and begging anyone with information to come forward. His determination was unwavering. If police couldn't find his daughter, he would. Meanwhile, investigators obtained a search warrant for Nwabodo's apartment. Inside, they found what Kevin had feared most: traces of blood matching Felicia's DNA. The evidence confirmed she had been there, and more disturbingly, it suggested she had been harmed. They also found additional incriminating materials, including weapons and digital devices filled with the same disturbing internet searches. The case against Nwabodo was building rapidly, yet despite this damning evidence, there was one problem. Felicia's body was nowhere to be found. Without her remains, prosecutors knew they faced an uphill battle. A murder charge requires proof, and while blood evidence was strong, it was not enough on its own to guarantee a conviction. The absence of Felicia's body gave Nwabodo a sliver of protection, a gap in the case that he could exploit. For Kevin, this legal nuance was meaningless. He knew what the evidence meant. He knew his daughter had suffered, that she had likely been killed, and that the man responsible was still free. The idea that her killer might escape justice because her body had not yet been recovered was unbearable. He vowed to continue searching, no matter how long it took, to bring her home and close that gap once and for all. Weeks turned into months. The story of Felicia Johnson's disappearance continued to circulate in local and national media, keeping her case alive in the public eye. But behind the headlines was the agonizing reality of a family in limbo. Without a body, there could be no funeral, no closure, no chance to begin healing. Felicia's absence was a wound that refused to close. Reopening each day, her father woke up and realized she was still gone. In time, investigators expanded their search radius. They explored more remote areas, guided by digital evidence that placed Nwabodo's movements in certain regions after Felicia's disappearance. Still, the vastness of Houston's outskirts worked against them. Fields stretched for miles. Dense woods concealed countless secrets, and every creek or ditch seemed like it could hold the truth they were looking for. The search was overwhelming, but they persisted. Through it all, Kevin Johnson remained a constant presence. His devotion to his daughter became a symbol of perseverance for others facing similar tragedies. He refused to let Felicia's story fade, knowing that once the public's attention drifted away, so too would the urgency of the investigation. He spoke at vigils, stood before cameras, and told anyone who would listen, "My daughter didn't deserve this. She deserves justice." And yet, justice remained just out of reach. Chuck Wubuka Nwabodo was still free, still living his life as though nothing had happened. The knowledge that he could walk the same streets, shop in the same stores, or sit in the same restaurants as ordinary citizens, while Felicia remained missing, filled Kevin with rage. How could a man suspected of such horrific crimes be allowed to walk freely, shielded by legal technicalities and the absence of a body? The case was no longer just about Felicia. It had become a larger question of how justice is pursued, how evidence is valued, and how families are left to suffer while predators slip through cracks in the system. For Kevin, the fight was personal. But for many watching, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of how fragile justice can be when the evidence is incomplete. Felicia Johnson had come to Houston chasing a dream. Instead, she had been caught in a nightmare. The discovery of her blood-stained phone had opened the first chapter of that nightmare. But the chapters that followed revealed something even more chilling. A system struggling to keep up with the horrors it uncovered, and a father forced to fight for his daughter long after she was gone. By the summer of 2022, Felicia Johnson's case had begun to take on national attention. News outlets covered her disappearance with headlines that emphasized both the horror of her final moments and the mystery surrounding her fate. Candlelight vigils were held in Houston and San Diego, gatherings where family, friends, and even strangers prayed for answers. At these vigils, Kevin Johnson often stood front and center, holding a large photo of Felicia, his voice breaking as he begged for justice. The community response was powerful, but it could not erase the gnawing reality. Felicia was still missing, and the man suspected of harming her was still walking free. The search for her body continued in wooded parks, rural outskirts, and secluded areas that stretched endlessly across Houston's vast geography. Volunteers carried flyers, water bottles, and flashlights, their shoes muddied from the terrain. Each time a search party set out, Kevin clung to hope. But each time they returned empty-handed, he felt that hope slipping further away. Investigators, however, were not standing still. The evidence collected from Chuck Wubuka Nwabodo's apartment painted a haunting picture. DNA testing confirmed that Felicia's blood had been found on multiple surfaces inside his home. There were signs of cleanup, as though someone had tried desperately to erase the traces of violence that had occurred there. The devices seized from his apartment revealed his sinister intent. Detailed searches about dismemberment, how to transport bodies, and how to make evidence disappear. The sheer number of these searches suggested not a passing thought, but a fixation, one that had been building long before Felicia arrived in Houston. Despite this mountain of evidence, there was still one crucial piece missing: Felicia's body. Prosecutors knew they needed it to move forward with a strong murder case. Without it, they risked creating reasonable doubt in the eyes of a jury, giving Enwabodo the chance to walk free. Investigators pressed on, expanding their search parameters and analyzing his movements after Felicia vanished. They tracked his phone, his credit card purchases, his gas station visits, trying to reconstruct his actions in the days following the 15th of April. Each breadcrumb brought them closer to understanding what might have happened, but still, no body. Kevin Johnson grew increasingly vocal about his frustration. He was grateful for the work being done, but to him, the pace of justice felt unbearable. He watched as Enwabodo lived his life freely, shielded by technicalities, while Felicia remained hidden in the shadows. For a grieving father, the contrast was almost too much to bear. "My daughter is not here," he said at one press conference, "and the man who did this is still out there. How is that justice?" It was not just Kevin who was outraged. Advocacy groups for missing women, particularly those supporting women of color and transgender women, rallied around Felicia's case. They argued that her disappearance highlighted systemic failures. The vulnerability of women lured into dangerous situations, the slow pace of legal response, and the lack of urgency often shown when victims are Black or transgender. Felicia's story, they said, was not isolated. It was part of a larger epidemic of violence that disproportionately targeted marginalized women, women whose cases too often went unsolved. Inside Houston's police department, detectives felt the pressure. They knew the community demanded answers, and they wanted justice for Felicia too. Their investigation revealed that Enwabodo had a disturbing history of searching online for sex workers, arranging meetings, and canceling at the last moment. It appeared he had been practicing, perfecting his approach, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Felicia, tragically, had crossed his path at exactly the wrong time. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. This was not an act of passion, nor a spontaneous crime. It was premeditated, calculated, and cold-blooded. Enwabodo had lured Felicia with the promise of money, knowing she would accept because she was stranded and in need. Once she entered his car, she was trapped. Everything that happened afterward, the drive to his apartment, the violence inside, the cleanup attempts, had been rehearsed in his mind long before she ever arrived in Houston. As summer turned to fall, the weight of Felicia's absence pressed heavier on Kevin. He returned to San Diego at times, but his heart remained in Houston. He often described his days as divided between searching for Felicia and speaking out about her case. He wanted the world to remember her not just as a victim, but as a daughter, a dreamer, a vibrant young woman who had so much ahead of her. He refused to let her name fade into the endless list of unsolved disappearances. In October of 2022, investigators believed they finally had enough to pursue charges against Enwabodo. The evidence from his apartment, combined with his online searches and the digital trail linking him to Felicia, was overwhelming. Prosecutors prepared to move forward with a case. But before they could execute their plan fully, news broke that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Enwabodo had fled. Somehow, despite being under surveillance and under suspicion for months, he had slipped away. Whether he left the state or the country remained unclear. What was certain was that he was gone, and with him went the immediate possibility of arrest. The man believed to be responsible for Felicia Johnson's disappearance, the man whose apartment had been stained with her blood, whose devices revealed his twisted mind, was now beyond the reach of law enforcement. For Kevin Johnson, the news was devastating. It was not just that his daughter's killer remained free, it was that the system had once again failed to act quickly enough. Every delay, every missed opportunity, had given Enwabodo the time he needed to escape. Kevin's grief turned to anger, his voice rising at public events as he demanded to know how this had been allowed to happen. "He should have been behind bars months ago," he said. "Now he's gone, and my daughter still hasn't come home." The outrage rippled through the community. People who had followed Felicia's case from the beginning felt betrayed. How could someone so obviously guilty evade justice so easily? The frustration was not just about Enwabodo, but about what his escape symbolized. The cracks in a system that allowed predators to outmaneuver justice, while families were left to suffer. For investigators, the manhunt for Enwabodo became a top priority. They issued alerts, contacted federal agencies, and worked with international partners to track him down. But each day that passed without an arrest widened the wound. Felicia remained missing, her killer remained free, and her family remained trapped in limbo. By the end of 2022, the story of Felicia Johnson had transformed. It was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about systemic failure, about the urgency of protecting vulnerable women, and about the resilience of a father who refused to stop fighting. Kevin Johnson's voice grew louder, his determination unshakable. As long as his daughter remained missing and her killer remained free, he would not rest. Felicia's case had become bigger than one family's tragedy. It was a test of whether justice could be delivered when the odds seemed stacked against it. And as the year drew to a close, one question loomed larger than all the rest. Would the system ever catch up to the man who had stolen Felicia's life? By early 2023, Felicia Johnson's case had stretched into a year-long nightmare. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing woman had become something darker. A story of evasion, bureaucracy, and a predator who seemed to stay one step ahead. For Kevin Johnson, every day felt like living with a wound that refused to close. He spent countless hours calling detectives, posting flyers, and keeping his daughter's face alive in the public eye. "If I stop talking," he told one reporter, "then Felicia disappears all over again." Then, in February 2023, a discovery shattered what little hope remained. Deep in the Sam Houston National Forest, a vast, dense expanse of trees and shadows north of Houston, human remains were found. The bones were scattered, the forest floor concealing them under months of leaves and earth. At first, investigators did not want to say much. They needed DNA. They needed confirmation. Kevin Johnson clung to denial, praying it wasn't his daughter. But in his heart, he knew. Weeks later, DNA tests confirmed the remains belonged to Felicia. Her body had been dismembered, discarded in a place where only chance could have uncovered her. The confirmation brought closure, but it was the kind of closure that tore open new wounds. Kevin collapsed in grief when detectives delivered the news. For months, He had prayed for a miracle, for the chance that Felicia might walk through a door and smile that radiant smile again. Instead, all he had now was the knowledge that she had been brutally silenced, her dreams cut short, and her body left in pieces. The community's grief deepened into outrage. Vigils were held again, this time with more candles, more photographs, and more tears. Friends remembered Felicia's kindness, her determination, and her courage to live as her true self in a world that too often judged her harshly. But beneath the tears was anger. Anger that her killer had not only escaped justice, but had time to erase his tracks, discard her body, and vanish. Investigators doubled down on their pursuit of Chukwuebuka Nwabodo. They followed leads suggesting he had fled to Nigeria, his country of origin, possibly supported by family networks there. Interpol issued a red notice, placing him on international watch lists. Yet, catching him was far from guaranteed. Extradition processes were complex, requiring diplomatic cooperation, legal negotiations, and airtight evidence. Each hurdle threatened to slow justice even further. For Kevin, the thought that his daughter's killer might live freely overseas was unbearable. He launched his own campaign, speaking to anyone who would listen, demanding international cooperation. He told Felicia's story on podcasts, at rallies, in interviews, anywhere he could. His message was clear. My daughter was murdered. The man who did it cannot hide forever. We will not stop until he is found. But while Kevin fought for accountability, Felicia's story began to take on broader meaning. Advocates pointed out that her death highlighted how marginalized women, particularly Black transgender women, were often left unprotected and unheard. They spoke of systemic neglect, of predators exploiting vulnerable women, of authorities moving too slowly until it was too late. Felicia's murder was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a disturbing pattern. The LGBTQ+ community, in particular, rallied around Felicia's name. Her case became a rallying cry for stronger protections, faster investigations, and more resources dedicated to finding missing women. Her story was shared at pride events, vigils, and advocacy meetings across the country. The message was clear. Felicia mattered, and justice for her was justice for all women living on society's margins. Meanwhile, the details investigators uncovered about Nwabodo grew more chilling. His search history revealed a man obsessed not only with killing, but with the process of killing, how to dispose of a body, how to evade DNA detection, how to live like a serial predator. He had purchased tools that pointed to a plan far beyond impulsive violence. A chainsaw, heavy-duty trash bags, industrial cleaning supplies. These were not items of chance. They were pieces of a blueprint for murder. The $500 promised to Felicia now looked even more sinister. It was never about money. It was bait, designed to lure her into a trap he had already prepared. The fact that he withdrew the money from his bank account but never gave it to her confirmed the deception. Felicia's death, investigators concluded, had likely been sealed the moment she accepted his offer on Snapchat. This realization only deepened the sense of injustice. Felicia had been vulnerable, new to Houston, financially strained, rejected from a job interview. She wasn't reckless. She was trying to survive. The very hope that pushed her to keep going had been turned against her. That was the cruelty of it. Her ambition to build a better life became the doorway to her death. As months passed after the discovery of her remains, Kevin Johnson carried both grief and determination. He often described Felicia as the light of his life, the daughter who always checked in, who always encouraged him to keep faith even during hard times. Losing her was not just losing a daughter, it was losing the very heartbeat of his family. And yet, he refused to let her be forgotten. He marched, spoke, and demanded action, because to him, silence meant surrender. Still, questions lingered. Why hadn't authorities arrested Nwabodo earlier, when the evidence was already overwhelming? Why had it taken so long to find Felicia's remains, and why had no one noticed his disturbing online searches until it was too late? Could she have been saved if the system had moved faster? Each unanswered question carried the weight of moral reckoning. Felicia's story was no longer just about one woman. It was about how society values or fails to value the lives of its most vulnerable. By the middle of 2023, Felicia's case had become a symbol. Her face appeared on banners at protests, her name spoken at rallies demanding reform. Yet, for Kevin, all the symbolism in the world could not erase the emptiness of his home, the silence where his daughter's voice used to be. He wanted justice not just in words, but in action. And until Nwabodo was behind bars, he would not rest. But the manhunt remained at a standstill. Leads ran dry, tips led to dead ends, and the trail overseas grew colder by the day. It was as if Nwabodo had dissolved into the air, leaving only the wreckage of Felicia's life behind. And so, the case hovered in a haunting limbo. The evidence was damning, the pain undeniable, but the justice Felicia deserved remained elusive, which leaves us with a haunting thought. How many more women like Felicia will be lost before systems change? How many more predators will find cracks to slip through, leaving families shattered in their wake? By the summer of 2023, the case of Felicia Johnson was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a story that echoed across borders. The discovery of her remains had forced the world to confront a harsh truth: her killer was still free. For Kevin Johnson, that truth was unbearable. Every day he woke with the same gnawing question: where is he? Chukwuebuka Nwabodo had become a ghost. Despite an arrest warrant, despite the mountain of evidence stacked against him, he had slipped through the cracks of the system. U.S. Marshals, federal investigators, and local police all pointed to the same conclusion. He was likely overseas, in Nigeria, beyond the easy reach of American law enforcement. For Kevin, that meant his daughter's killer could be walking through a marketplace, laughing at a bar, or sleeping soundly in another country while Felicia lay in a shallow grave thousands of miles away. The thought consumed him. He began making public appeals to the State Department, to Nigerian officials, to anyone who might have the power to push for extradition. But the machinery of international justice moved slowly, tangled in bureaucracy and diplomatic negotiations. Even with an Interpol red notice, the process could take years, if it happened at all. And Kevin knew time had a way of dulling public outrage. Cases grew cold not only because of lack of evidence, but because of fading attention. He refused to let that happen. He started a campaign, using social media and interviews to keep Felicia's name alive. He wanted every headline to remind the world that her killer was still out there. Justice delayed, he said, is justice denied. Meanwhile, new details emerged about Nwabodo's life before Felicia's death, details that made the case even more chilling. Investigators uncovered that he had a history of luring women with false promises of money and gifts. He cultivated an online persona that mixed charm with danger, presenting himself as wealthy and generous while hiding a much darker reality. Some women came forward after Felicia's death, admitting that he had tried similar tactics on them. They had been lucky enough to sense something was wrong and walk away. Felicia, tragically, had not. This painted a disturbing picture. Nwabodo wasn't just a man who committed one horrific act. He was a predator who had been testing the waters for years. Felicia's death may not have been his first attempt, only the first that investigators knew about. For Kevin, this was almost too much to bear. It meant that his daughter's murder wasn't just a crime of passion or opportunity. It was premeditated, calculated, the culmination of a pattern of predatory behavior. Felicia had walked into the hands of a man who had been planning, waiting, and perfecting his cruelty. In the months after her remains were found, the community continued to rally. Vigils turned into protests. Protests into advocacy campaigns. LGBTQ+ organizations highlighted her case as an example of how trans women of color face disproportionate violence and are often left unprotected by slow-moving institutions. Activists pointed out that if Felicia had been a young white woman from a wealthy family, the case might have unfolded differently faster, with more resources poured into the search. The uncomfortable question lingered. Had Felicia's identity shaped the urgency, or lack thereof, of the investigation? Felicia's friends added their voices to the chorus. They shared memories of her kindness, her resilience, her laughter that could light up a room. They painted a picture of a woman who was far more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, who had plans and ambitions that reached beyond the walls of Houston. Her story became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of potential lost. But symbols could only go so far. Kevin wanted justice in the real world, not just in the court of public opinion. He grew frustrated with each delay, each carefully worded statement from officials that promised progress but produced little. He compared his fight to pushing against a wall that refused to budge, and yet, he kept pushing. In late 2023, reporters asked him if he had considered giving up. His answer was firm. I can't. Felicia is my daughter. I will fight until my last breath. His determination became a story in itself, a father's refusal to let the world forget. Still, the manhunt dragged on. Nwabodo's name faded from daily headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher stories. But Kevin carried the burden quietly, day after day. Each time he looked at his daughter's photograph, he felt both love and rage. Love for the young woman she was, and rage for the life stolen from her. He often replayed their last conversations in his head. Felicia had been hopeful, talking about finding her place, about making Houston work for her. She had asked him to keep praying for her. He never imagined that those would be her final words. The cruel irony was that Felicia's killer had promised her opportunity $500 to ease her struggles, a chance at stability. It wasn't much, but to someone who was trying to rebuild, it was enough to say yes, enough to take the risk. That yes cost her everything. By the time the one-year anniversary of her death approached, Felicia's case had become both deeply personal and painfully universal. It was about her, but it was also about countless other women who disappeared under similar circumstances. Each candle lit in her honor symbolized not only her memory, but the memory of others who had not received justice either. And Kevin, standing at those vigils, always reminded people, my daughter is not just a hashtag. She is not just a statistic. She is Felicia. And I will not stop until justice is served. The question remained. Would justice ever come? Would the man who hunted her, who killed her, who dismembered her body and discarded her like nothing, ever be held accountable? Or would Felicia's story end the way too many do, with grief, outrage, and silence? For Kevin Johnson, silence was never an option. And for those who knew Felicia, forgetting was unthinkable. Her story was now woven into the fabric of a larger fight, a fight for justice, for protection, for a world where women like Felicia are seen, heard, and defended before it's too late. But even as that fight continued, one haunting reality remained. Her killer was still out there. As 2024 arrived, Felicia Johnson's name still echoed through Houston and beyond. But her story was no longer just about one young woman's tragic death. It had become a mirror held up to society, forcing everyone to ask hard questions. Questions about justice, about safety, about who is protected and who is left to fend for themselves. For Kevin Johnson, life had become a series of dual realities. In one, he was a grieving father, quietly mourning his daughter in private moments, sitting in her room, holding on to the belongings she left behind, hearing her laughter in his mind. In the other, he was a fighter, a public voice demanding accountability, refusing to let Felicia's name slip from memory. He had learned to live in both worlds because he had no choice. His campaign for justice grew louder. He worked with advocacy groups, contacted federal agencies, and even traveled to Washington to push for more aggressive action. He didn't want Felicia to be just another unsolved case lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. He wanted her name to force change. He wanted her face to be remembered not only by those who loved her, but by lawmakers, judges, and law enforcement officials. Every time he spoke, his words carried the weight of a father who had lost everything. Felicia was my only daughter, he told one crowd. They took my sunshine, my joy, and I won't stop until the man who did this is brought back to face justice. And yet, the system seemed unmoved. Despite the evidence, despite the international notice, months passed, with no arrest. Rumors swirled. Some said Nwabodo had been seen in Nigeria. Others whispered he had moved through Europe. Still others claimed he was hiding in plain sight in Houston under a different identity. None of it was confirmed. Each rumor felt like smoke with no fire, taunting Kevin and those who cared about Felicia. Still, the story did not die. True crime podcasts picked up the case. Journalists revisited the timeline, uncovering more about the predator who had slipped away. Each retelling added another layer of outrage, another reason to keep the pressure alive. Felicia's face, smiling, vibrant, alive, appeared again and again, a reminder of the life cut short. And as her story spread, more people began to see her not only as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. Here was a young woman who had fought for her place in the world, who had dared to dream even when doors closed in her face, who had embraced her identity despite the dangers it brought. Felicia's courage in life became as powerful as the tragedy of her death. But for Kevin, symbolism was never enough. He wanted something concrete: an arrest, a trial, a conviction. He wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had stolen his daughter and see him stripped of freedom. Without that, he said, there could be no peace. The fight for justice in Felicia's case revealed the cracks in the system. Critics pointed out that predators like Nwabodo thrive in those cracks, exploiting the vulnerable, vanishing across borders, slipping through the fingers of authorities too bound by process to act swiftly. Felicia's death, they argued, was not only the result of one man's evil, but of a society that allowed evil to flourish unchecked. And yet, in the middle of this storm, there were moments of grace. Vigils where strangers embraced Kevin and told him they were praying for him. Memorials where Felicia's friends spoke of her kindness, her energy, her dreams. Online spaces where people who had never met her shared her story, determined to keep her name alive. Felicia's light had been extinguished, but her legacy burned brighter than ever. She had become more than a headline. She had become a movement. Still, the questions lingered. How long would it take to bring her killer to justice? Would the system ever catch up to him? And if not, what message would that send to other predators waiting in the shadows? For Kevin, the only answer was persistence. He vowed to fight for the rest of his life if necessary. His mission was no longer just about Felicia. It was about every daughter, every sister, every woman whose disappearance was met with indifference or delay. He wanted Felicia's story to change things, to make the world safer for those who came after her. And so, the story ends not with closure, but with a challenge. A challenge to a justice system that moves too slowly. A challenge to a society that looks away when marginalized women vanish. A challenge to all of us to see, to care, and to act before another Felicia is lost. Because Felicia Johnson's life mattered, her dreams mattered. And until the man who took them away is held accountable, her story is not finished. Kevin Johnson will make sure of that, and so must we.